With a full shipbuilding system and upcoming mod support, Starfield will eventually become the open world Star Wars game of my dreams. And today, we're remaking one of my favorite ships from the Star Wars expanded universe, the Ebon Hawk from Knights of the Old Republic. Since this is my first ship build video and was one of my first full attempts at building a ship from scratch, I took a lot of time to try and really make this as accurate as I could, given some of the limitations and requirements that you have with shipbuilding in the game. This video has no mods, no bugs, no tricks, nothing that you won't be able to replicate yourself on a vanilla game. For this build, and any future builds that I make, part of the challenge for me is trying to find a good balance between having the exterior and interior match the original as best as possible. For instance, I could have used different habitat modules or a different cockpit to give a slightly more accurate representation of the ship's exterior, but the layout and the tone of the interior would have been much further off from the original had I done so. To build the ship as I'm showing it off today, you're going to want Pilot Rank 3, as this is a B-class ship, and Starship Design Rank 2 if you want to use all the exact pieces in this video. The ship's components are mostly a mix of Deimos, HopeTech, and Nova Galactic. For a lot of this build, I was able to get the pieces I needed at my outpost, using the landing pad with the built-in ship builder. From there, I had to travel between a few different headquarters for the individual manufacturers. A good example of this is the HopeTech 2x2 HABs, which I was only able to buy from their headquarters on Polvo. For most of the habitats, I opted for HopeTech, as I felt the darker interiors were a bit more representative of the original ship. If you want to have HABs that line up a bit more to create a much more seamless hull, you might want to opt for Tayo mid-decks instead. I actually used a Tayo top 2x1 HAB for part of the ship. Once again, showing a bit of the compromise that you make between interior design versus exterior. But we'll be going into all the specifics for these components in just a bit. To show off the construction of this, we're going to break the ship down from left to right. Well, our left. Meaning that we'll be starting with the starboard section, and then moving on to the central corridor and cockpit, and then finally the port side of the ship. For this, I scrapped a ship that I wasn't going to be using anyway. In this case, it was the UC prison ship from the Crimson Fleet questline. Starting off, I'm using the Deimos 120LD landing bay, which is slightly longer than some of the other available bays, but works well for the overall design. The original Ebon Hawk really only has one usable deck, but to do that in Starfield would make the ship way too wide and really unwieldy. To try and make the ship a bit more form-fitting, I opted to have one of the boarding ramps that requires you to take a ladder up to what will serve as the main deck, and having the landing gear and cargo modules hidden on that bottom layer alongside it. Following this, we'll immediately be going into some of the cosmetic items, starting with the Stroud Nosecap B on the front of the lander, as well as the Stroud Nosecap C, starboard 4, immediately to its right, to help form the shape of the wing. Directly on top of this wing, we'll be adding the Deimos Spine E4 and the Spine G directly behind it. On top of the landing pad itself, and connected to the Nosecap B, we're adding two HopeTech 2x1 habitats, which I will later swap out for a 2x2. This is one of several places in the build where you might want to change things up a bit depending on your personal preferences. The 2x2 HABs have a more streamlined look to them, but offer way less actual function than the individual 2x1s. For now, I opted for the workshop and the living quarters, which is fairly accurate to the original ship's layout. With these two habitats in place, we can add another Deimos Spine E, this time in the aft position. And directly below this, we'll add a Deimos Skeg A, Skeg B, and finally another Skeg A to finish off this part of the starboard corridor. Even early on, you can see how it's starting to resemble part of the Ebon Hawk. To cap things off on the wing for now, we're going to add two Nova Cowlings, the 2LSF and the 2LSA. These are going to wind up being temporary, as I swap them out later in the build. However, you might prefer the Nova Cowlings to what I use later on. From here, I added a 1x1 HopeTech companionway. You can also use a Deimos hull structural piece here, as this HAB is largely just for structure anyway. I, however, opted for the 1x1 to match the design of the 2x1s, and behind this we'll be adding the Tayo Cap starboard aft, which will be the last piece we're going to add for the starboard section of the ship for right now. Moving on to the central corridor, we'll be connecting a 3x1 HopeTech engineering bay and a Magellan C1 cockpit attached to that. We'll then sandwich that between two Stroud Nosecap Bs, one on top and one on the bottom. You'll note that the Magellan cockpit does stick out a little bit, which might not be the most accurate exterior choice, but I personally preferred the interior layout for this cockpit. There are a couple cockpits that will be much more flush with these nose caps. However, it requires being connected to a habitat directly below it in order to access it via ladder. Connected to the top nose cap, we're adding a 2x1 Taio's Captain's Quarters Top A. And while this won't match the interiors of the other modules that we've added so far, the overall shape works best. And, hey, you're the captain, so you get the nicer quarters. Behind the 3x1 Hope Tech on the main deck, we'll start adding some more of the ship's guts, including the reactor and the grav drive. I opted for a Class B reactor, largely because the engines I liked the most were Class B as well. You can really pick anything that fits here, but I went for a Dogstar reactor and a Nova Galactic drive, both of which will immediately be covered up by another Stroud Nose Cap B, aka one of the most common pieces in this entire build. We're not going to be touching engines, fuel tanks, and cargo until after we have the bulk of the ship's interiors laid out, meaning that we'll start to mirror some of what we did on the starboard side of the ship. For this, I added a 2x1 Hope Tech Infirmary and a Hope Tech 2x1 Armory, along with the 1x1 companionway connected at the back. We'll come back to the wings a little bit later, since that's just a matter of copying what we already did on the first side. We'll be placing 2 fuel tanks, one on each side, connected in that small gap that we left between the 2x1 habs and the 1x1 companionways. And directly behind these fuel tanks, which I swapped out for a different model in just a bit, we'll connect the 2 engines, 2 Nova 1020 Class B engines, which requires Starship Design 2. Between the engines, I'll be adding a Deimos Hull A and a Deimos Belly 4, along with a mirrored Taio cap on the starboard engine. It was at this point that I swapped out the original fuel tanks for ones that were only 1 unit tall. In this case, the 500T Helium-3 tanks. These work really well because they have a connection point on top, and we're gonna need structural pieces in order to hide them. If anything, that's gonna be one of the trickiest parts for a lot of ship builds, finding creative ways to hide some of the necessary components. To cover these, we'll be using 2 Stroud A caps, which will cover up the tanks and sit right ahead of the engines. Behind these, we'll be adding the Stroud cowling 1LA PT. Using these 2 cowlings in the final build will contribute to a significantly lower mobility. I opted for them at this stage because the Outpost shipbuilder didn't have the extra engines that I wanted. To help slightly fill in the gap that we have on the port side, I added a Deimos 4 bumper, and from here I went ahead and mirrored the wing on the port side, including the 2 Nova cowlings that we'll be swapping out a little bit later. You'll notice that I haven't opted to color any of the ship yet, the reason being that I don't want to change the colors until I'm happy with the final build, since there's no saved colors or eyedroppers or anything that would have made it easy to change colors on the fly as you build out more of your ship. You do have the recent colors, but they don't save between shipbuilding sessions. Going to the ship's underbelly, I added 4 Stroud Eklund Aculander 11s, 2 on each side, as well as another Deimos belly connected to the port landers. On top of the Taio's Captain Quarters, I added a Deimos Slim Docker, and it was at this point that I finally decided to swap out the Nova cowlings for wings, and instead used a total of 4 Stroud Eklund Cap A's, which I really liked as they helped to hide a bit of the ship's undercarriage. Given that the Ebon Hawk is first and foremost a light freighter, and a smuggler ship at that, it made sense to give it a shielded cargo hold, which I placed below the central corridor, as well as 2 Galleon S-202 holds, one on each side of the ship by the engine caps. The final steps for us at the Outpost builder is adding shields and weapons. For the shield generator, I opted for the Sexton SG-200. I would say that the weapon systems are another way in which you can customize the ship a bit more. In lore, the Ebon Hawk had dual turbo laser turrets, 2 heavy laser cannons, and proton torpedoes. To try and mimic this, while still wanting a ship that would be viable for combat, I opted for a single Scorch 60MW up top, a KE-42 cannon on each of the wings, and the Atlatl 270B missile launcher directly below the cockpit. And that completes the preliminary build, or at least as much as I can do from the Outpost builder. Still, this accounts for the majority of the build, and it didn't require me to fly around to multiple places to get the bulk of the ship done. This first draft cost almost 200,000 credits, and with only the 2 engines so far, the ship has a mobility of 20, which is admittedly pretty low. after taking a quick look at the interior, we'll work on the final draft of the ship. I think the HopeTech halves work really well for the interior, given their darker color and tone. The captain's quarters does stand out a bit more for this reason, but I didn't mind it all too much. Our next stop after this was to the Stroud Eklund showroom in the Neon Core, where I opted to add 2 Slayton Aerospace 4110 engines to bring the mobility up to 60. Now that's a little bit more like it. The last step after this, which is entirely optional and will come down to personal preference, was to swap out the 2x1 halves on the main deck with 2x2s. This required going to Hopetown and speaking with Anaya Riemann in HopeTech's main office. I chose to add the HopeTech computer core on the port side and the cargo hull on the starboard side. This gives the ship a slightly better look on the exterior, at the expense of losing some of the functionality of the individual 2x1 halves. I feel like with how exclusive the 2x2 halves are to come by, they really needed to have some more usefulness. After using the ship for a bit, I did wind up going back to the individual 2x1s. But with the building done, we can go ahead and color our ship. A really useful trick is to use Control-Click to select multiple components at once in order to color them. I did my best to try and match the rusty reds and medium grays of the Ebon Hawk, and trying to match the color placement as well. And that is pretty much it. I've seen a few different attempts online at building the Ebon Hawk in Starfield, and I noticed a few similarities across a lot of the builds that I saw, namely using the Deimos spines and skegs, as they really are perfect for the fins that you have on the original ship's wings. The original Nova cowlings that we used are probably a little more accurate, but I found that the Stroude caps give the ship a little bit more dimension, and this did ultimately clock in at over 200,000 credits. But just a word of warning, shipbuilding in Starfield is not cheap. Thank you for watching. I already have a short list of other ships that I would love to recreate. Making the Ebon Hawk ultimately meant going through a few different drafts, until I finally found the one that I was the happiest with. But I think it also gave me a better understanding of the shipbuilding at the same time. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.